Hello, I'm Luciana Spraker with the City of Savannah's Municipal Archives, and I want to welcome you to another Hungry for History program. This year, we are launching a series of shorter programs called History Bites, just a little taste of history. I'm pleased to have Kathryn White from the Juliette Gordon Low Birthplace join us today to share a bite of history regarding an enslaved woman named Nancy and her Benne cakes. But first, a little tidbit about Kathryn. Born and raised in North Carolina, Kathryn White attended Macalester College and University of Minnesota Twin Cities before moving to Savannah for, as she says, no better reason than she missed the ocean and remembered Savannah's beauty from a Girl Scout troop trip to the Juliette Gordon Low Birthplace when she was just 13. She's since moved away several times, working in museum education at the Geneva Historical Society in Geneva, New York, and the Belmont Paul National Historic Site in Washington, D.C., before returning to Savannah for good in 2014 to work as the Tours and Education Manager at the Juliette Gordon Low Birthplace. I'm now pleased to turn it over to Kathryn White.
We have a long-standing tradition in Girl Scouts of sharing stories of brave and resourceful women for instruction and inspiration. In early Girl Scout handbooks, these remarkable women are called trail makers. The 1933 handbook explains that trail makers venture ahead and make plain the way for those who follow. Their task requires courage and sacrifice. They have great practical knowledge, which prepares them to meet emergencies readily and efficiently. Our most celebrated trail maker is Juliette Low, founder of Girl Scouts. She is a beloved figure. A visit to our museum, her birthplace, is like a pilgrimage for some. Girl Scouts tell us that they come ready to be inspired. They feel a sense of belonging. They feel like Juliette is their friend. It is an easy pleasure for tour guides to share tales of Juliette's talents, childhood adventures, and remarkable achievements. But we are telling these stories in a grand Southern house about a girl born in 1860, white daughter of an elite Savannah family. There are other more difficult stories to tell. One story, a story of a woman named Nancy and her Benne cakes, has put us on a path to deepening our understanding of Juliette Low's story and the story of Girl Scouts. Before I tell her story, let's pause to consider the Benne seed. If you are from Savannah, you know what bennies are. Benne cakes and wafers, after all, are much loved Low Country delicacies. For everyone else, I'll briefly explain and encourage you to investigate and eat further on your own. There is a wealth of rich history contained in these tiny seeds. Bennies are close cousins to modern sesame seeds. The seeds, along with the name Benne, traveled with enslaved West Africans from West Africa to the sea islands of South Carolina and Georgia over 3 centuries ago. In West African cooking, they are used in sweet cakes and cookies and in savory stews. Benne leaves are used to make a medicinal drink to soothe a troubled stomach. They can be pressed for oil or ground for flour. Here in Savannah, bennies were first grown by enslaved people in their own gardens. Enslaved cooks introduced them to enslavers' tables. And now Nancy's story. In December 1864, U.S. General Sherman marched his troops into Savannah, liberating the city from Confederate forces. Juliette Low vividly remembered this time, even though she was 4 years old in 1864. She and her sisters were hungry. Even for a family like the Gordons, food supplies were running short. Juliette's father was away fighting for the Confederacy. Together in the Gordon family home, there were the 3 little Gordon girls, their grandmother, mother, aunts, and enslaved women and children. Juliette's grandmother, Sarah Gordon, ordered the enslaved workers of the household not to leave the house or speak with the U.S. soldiers. Nancy, the cook, defied these orders. Nancy baked Benne cakes, candies, and wafers, arranged them on a tray, and went out to sell them to the U.S. soldiers in the streets. In Savannah, enslaved people were often hired out by their enslavers as laborers or sent to the markets to sell goods, including candies and cakes. some enslaved people were permitted to hire themselves out or sell goods they produced at their own expense to make money for themselves on the side. This was common in Savannah and other southern cities. Many white Savannians would have seen this as maintaining the status quo. Enslaved Savannians would have seen these excursions as opportunities to hear news, make contacts, and exercise some little self-agency in a society that stole that agency away. So Nancy, with her tray of Benne cakes, would not have seemed out of place on Savannah's streets, and Nancy would have been gathering information. This story, told by the Gordon family, ends with Nancy returning and giving money to grandmother Sarah to buy nourishing food for the household. We don't have Nancy's account of this event. Nancy, who knew that the arrival of the US troops meant that she was a free woman. What were her own thoughts? Why did Nancy act as she did in this moment when her world had changed? Overall, visitors to our house have been receptive to this story, but it's also led to uncomfortable moments and even upsetting one for guides and visitors. One of our interpreters did not like telling this story because she felt that Nancy was still a slave in her mind. Visitors have volunteered that some masters were very good to their slaves, an impossibility that requires a denial. An elderly Savannian identified bennies as, I'm quoting, a crop the Negroes plant in their back gardens. This is a lot for a tour guide to process and manage in the scope of a 45-minute tour about Juliette Low and the founding of Girl Scouts. The most daunting audience can be little girls who have been primed beforehand to hero worship Juliette Low. On hearing that the Gordons were slaveholders, one junior Girl Scout stopped dead and said, wait a minute, I thought they were the good guys. One mother reported that her brownie Girl Scout was lively through the whole tour, but on the ride home got thoughtful. She asked, so Juliette Low's family owned slaves? Yes. Then why are we Girl Scouts? We're still learning to work through these moments to balance a truthful accounting of our site's history with preserving that sense of excitement, of inspiration, and of belonging that all Girl Scouts share through the telling of Juliette Low's Girl Scout story in a house that, on its opening as a museum in 1956 in still segregated Savannah, was intended as a house for all. Telling Nancy's story planted the seed that continues to grow into a full reckoning with difficult parts of our site's history. We continue to read and research to add to the knowledge we can share of the people who were enslaved here. Recent archaeological explorations confirmed that enslaved people lived and worked in an outbuilding on our site and cooked their own food in its rediscovered hearth. Visitors can now read the 1860 slave schedule listing the people held in slavery by the Gordons that year, listed by age, racial category, and gender, but not by name. It's likely that Nancy is the 50-year-old mixed-raced woman listed first. Nancy's story has also inspired a food program for Girl Scouts, exploring food stories not only from our house's history, but also stories of trailblazing women from history beyond our walls who used food to change the world for the better, for themselves and others. The Juliette Gordon Low Birthplace is currently working to situate our site's interpretation more firmly within the context of the progressive era, the early 1900s, when Juliette Low founded Girl Scouts here in Savannah. But Nancy will always be present. Her story and the stories of others who were enslaved here during Juliette Low's childhood allow us to acknowledge the history of slavery at Juliette Low's birthplace. Nancy also reminds us to make room in our narrative for more than one trailblazing woman. Juliette Low accomplished great things, but she was not Wonder Woman, flawless with an unblemished origin story. Acknowledging that she had feet of clay opens the door for us to share untold stories of women who helped put Juliette Low on the path to founding Girl Scouts and women who came after her, who insisted that Girl Scouts truly become what Juliette Low called it, something for the girls of Savannah, all of America, and all the world. Nancy was a trailmaker. In a time of upheaval and uncertainty, she used her practical knowledge to make a difference for herself and others. She had the courage to take a risk, break the rules, and take action. Coming to grips with her story has helped us on our path to inspiring future trailmakers in a deeper, richer way. All that from a seed.
Thank you, Kathryn. That was really interesting. I have a couple questions which you may or may not be able to answer. Did Nancy have her own family during this time period?
We really don't know much about Nancy. We found mention of a Nancy in an 1830s letter written by Juliette Low's grandmother, Sarah Gordon, where it was clear Nancy was moving back and forth between their plantation house, their labor camp, and their townhouse, and was given extra authority. So already in the 1830s, she's got the trust of her family and maybe a more skilled role in the household. And then we have an 1886 letter describing the death of a longtime family servant named Nancy, but we have nothing else right now about Nancy's life, except for this story from 1864. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned an inventory or a listing of other enslaved individuals that were in the house. Can you recall this moment, some of their other names, just so we can put them out there?
So the list, they're nameless in the list, but we do know the name of at least one other enslaved person on the list, a child. Her name was Hetty. We believe she's the youngest person on the list, at that time, 1 year old in 1860. So she's between the age of Juliette and her older sister, Eleanor. And we have a story of a Hetty told by Juliette Low's elder sister. They describe her as pretty little Hetty, which is one of the reasons we think it was this 1 year old based on the ages of the other children in the slave schedule, and that she was their constant playmate. And that grandmother, Sarah Gordon, who attended the Presbyterian church across the street from our house, the independent Presbyterian church that at that time preached that slavery was justified by Christianizing the enslaved people, held Sunday schools in her room, Sunday school classes, and mandated that the enslaved children of the household attend. And Hetty attended that, was naughty and was put in the corner as punishment. That's what we know about Hetty. We don't know anything else but this small story from her childhood. Mm-hmm. But it's a vivid example of how there were other children living in this house when Juliette Low was a child that we don't know much about.
Yeah, certainly, yeah. Well, I really appreciate you sharing this story. I think it's important, and it's important for Nancy's story, but also to sort of show that there are other people that are not in the written record or not well documented that are important, and were not just trailmakers and trailblazers, but great influences on the people we know about's life, so Juliette and others like her. So I appreciate you taking time today.
Well, thank you for having me, Luciana.